At first, it looked like a routine commute. The same road, the same bridge, the same crack in the concrete that Marcus Webb had driven past every single morning for 3 years on his way to a construction site in Harlan County, Kentucky. He was a civil structural engineer. He noticed things like that. Not obsessively, professionally. The way people who build things look at structures other people have stopped seeing. He had never thought much about the crack until the morning he pulled over, took a photograph on his phone, and compared it to the one in the bridge's most recent official inspection report. The reports were public record. He had looked them up out of habit. The crack in his photograph was wider than the crack in the official report. Not dramatically wider, but wider. And the official report, signed and dated 11 months earlier, described the crack as stable and unchanged from the prior inspection cycle. 2 photographs. 2 different stories. Marcus did not call a news station. He did not post it online. He sent a formal written inquiry to the Federal Highway Administration's Bridge Safety Division and attached both images. He had no idea what he was about to set in motion. Within 72 hours, his inquiry had been escalated to the FHWA's Office of Inspector General. Within a week, it had reached the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in Louisville. Within 30 days, federal investigators were quietly running a full structural audit of every bridge inspection report signed by the Kentucky Division of Transportation's Chief Bridge Inspector over the previous 8 years. What they found changed the scope of everything. The Chief Bridge Inspector was a man named Gerald Pratt, 53 years old, 18-year veteran of the Kentucky Division of Transportation, promoted to Chief Bridge Inspector 8 years earlier. The same month, investigators would later note that the falsification pattern began. 2 state commendations for infrastructure safety program development, quoted in regional publications, respected, trusted. His signature appeared on 2,100 bridge inspection reports across the 8-year window, but officers quickly noticed something unusual when they began cross-referencing those reports against independent variables. Field inspection teams log travel records, fuel receipts, and GPS coordinates when they visit bridge sites. Federal investigators pulled those records alongside Pratt's signed inspection reports and began matching them chronologically. The gap became visible almost immediately. Of the 2,100 inspection reports bearing Pratt's authorization, 340 showed no corresponding field team travel record for the inspection date listed. No fuel receipt. No GPS log. No supporting field photographs beyond images that appeared in multiple reports across different inspection cycles. The same photographs, used repeatedly to document different inspection dates at the same locations. The inspections had never happened. The reports had been produced at a desk, signed, filed, and entered into the state's official bridge safety database as completed physical inspections. What happened next surprised everyone involved. Federal structural engineers began conducting emergency independent physical inspections of the 340 bridges whose reports could not be supported by field records. The inspections ran around the clock across 17 counties. Results came back within 72 hours of the first team deployments. Of the 340 bridges re-inspected, 89 received immediate structural safety downgrades. Their conditions, assessed by independent federal engineers against actual physical measurements, were materially worse than the conditions Pratt's reports had described. 47 of the 89 showed active structural deterioration, concrete spalling, rebar corrosion, joint separation, load-bearing capacity degradation that had not appeared in any inspection report across multiple prior cycles. 34 bridges were closed to traffic immediately. Emergency weight restrictions were placed on an additional 22. The crack Marcus Webb had photographed on his morning commute was one of the 47. That bridge carried an average of 11,000 vehicles per day. The situation escalated faster than anyone expected when investigators expanded the scope of the financial review. Bridge inspections in Kentucky are administered under federal state infrastructure funding agreements. Completed inspection reports trigger federal infrastructure maintenance funding allocations. For every inspection report Pratt had filed, including the 340 that had never been physically conducted, the Kentucky Division of Transportation had submitted corresponding federal reimbursement claims to the FHWA. The financial architecture behind the falsified reports was not improvised. It was systematic. Financial crime analysts traced the payment flows outward. The federal reimbursement claims tied to uninspected bridges had generated approximately $94 million in federal infrastructure funding allocations over the 8-year window. Of that amount, Analysts identified approximately $61 million that had been diverted through a network of infrastructure consulting contracts awarded to firms that did not perform the work described in their service agreements. The consulting contracts had all been awarded through a single procurement authorization pathway inside the Kentucky Division of Transportation's contract management system. Every contract carried the same internal designation, KDOT-Infra-Chief. That code was not a department procurement officer designation. It was not a regional administrator designation. KDOT-Infra-Chief was the Chief Infrastructure Officer level procurement authority, reserved exclusively for the Director of Infrastructure Operations at the Kentucky Division of Transportation. The director was a man named Walter Creed, 61 years old, 24-year veteran of the division, Pratt's direct superior, the man who had promoted Pratt to Chief Bridge Inspector 8 years earlier. His procurement authorization code appeared on every consulting contract connected to the falsified inspection funding chain. At this point, the outcome was becoming inevitable. Investigators traced the consulting firms, 7 companies in total, all registered in Kentucky and Delaware within the 18-month window following Creed's appointment as infrastructure director. Names chosen to sound institutional: Bluegrass Infrastructure Advisory Group, LLC, Cumberland Valley Compliance Services, Appalachian Regional Bridge Systems Consulting. None had a physical office beyond a registered agent address. None had documented staff beyond a single principal. All had been awarded contracts ranging from $4 million to $11 million each for services described as bridge inspection quality assurance and federal compliance coordination, services that, according to field records, had never been performed. The financial architect behind the consulting network was identified at 3:44 p.m. on the 4th day of the investigation. FBI cyber analysts traced the encrypted coordination channel to a private server registered to an infrastructure consulting firm called Southern Tier Compliance Partners, LLC, operating out of a commercial address in Lexington, Kentucky. Southern Tier Compliance Partners had no federal contractor registration, no GSA listing, but it had filed corporate paperwork in Delaware 9 years earlier. 1 year before Creed had been appointed infrastructure director. The registered agent was a name that returned a federal employment record within minutes. Donna Halsey, 58 years old, former deputy administrator for bridge and tunnel infrastructure at the Federal Highway Administration. Before that, 12 years as a senior policy analyst at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she had specialized in federal state infrastructure funding, compliance, and bridge inspection protocol design. Before that, 8 years as an FHWA field operations engineer in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeastern regions. She had served on the internal FHWA review committee that established the federal reimbursement trigger protocols for state bridge inspection completion filings in 2007. She had personally written the guidance document that defined which inspection documentation elements were required to support a federal funding reimbursement claim, and which elements could be satisfied by signed state-level certification alone, without independent federal verification. That guidance document was still the operative standard for Kentucky bridge inspection reimbursement claims on the morning Marcus Webb pulled over on his commute. Halsey had retired from federal service 9 years earlier. Within 60 days of her retirement, Southern Tier Compliance Partners had been registered in Delaware. Within 6 months after that, Walter Creed, then Brewers Rao, had been appointed Director of Infrastructure Operations at the Kentucky Division of Transportation. Inside the encrypted communications archive that investigators extracted from Halsey's Lexington office network, her code name was the Engineer. A message in the archive dated approximately 3 years into the operation read, "Federal reimbursement is triggered by a signed state certification. The federal system does not independently verify the physical inspection. It trusts the certification. We are the certification." At 5:09 p.m., a federal judge in the Eastern District of Kentucky signed simultaneous search and arrest warrants for 13 locations across Kentucky and the Cayman Islands liaison request. At 5:44 p.m., the order went out. Execute. At the Kentucky Division of Transportation headquarters in Frankfort, both Pratt and Creed were detained without resistance. Pratt's office yielded 2 computers, an external hard drive hidden inside a hollowed-out bridge engineering manual, and $67,000 in cash. Creed's office contained printed procurement summaries, $140,000 in cash, and a prepaid phone with recent calls to the Cayman Islands. At Creed's residence, a floor safe held $620,000 in cash, 9 gold bars, and offshore documentation. At Pratt's, 4 burner phones, and $210,000 in cash. At Southern Tier Compliance Partners in Lexington, Halsey was inside when agents arrived. A document shredder was running. A rack-mounted server behind a built-in cabinet was active and transmitting. Cyber analysts suspended the transmission immediately. Halsey did not resist arrest. 7 additional locations ran simultaneously: shell company addresses, a real estate layering office, and 3 procurement officer residences. By midnight, analysts had completed their first full pass through the recovered server data. The operation had a name inside the archive: the span file. It contained the complete operational architecture, an 8-year inspection falsification schedule covering all 340 uninspected bridges, the corresponding federal reimbursement claims, the consulting contract award records, the shell company ownership map, the offshore consolidation account structure, and a detailed accounting of proceeds allocated to each participant. 38 individuals were in federal custody by 1:30 a.m. Gerald Pratt, Walter Creed, and Donna Halsey, 7 shell company principals, 11 Kentucky Division of Transportation Procurement and Inspection staff members, 9 additional individuals connected to the offshore account consolidation network and real estate layering structure. Assets frozen domestically, $180 million. Offshore accounts flagged through international cooperation. An estimated additional $140 million under active recovery proceedings. 34 bridges remained closed, pending full independent structural assessment. Emergency repair funding was authorized under federal infrastructure emergency provisions within 48 hours of the arrests. The detail that stayed with investigators after the arrests was not the money. It was the 47 bridges, 47 structures with active structural deterioration, concrete breaking down, metal corroding, load capacity declining, that had been marked safe in official reports for multiple consecutive inspection cycles. None of those conditions had appeared in any documentation that the state's bridge safety database contained. Every one of those structures had been certified as sound by a signature that cost somewhere between $12,000 and $31,000 per report to produce. An average of 11,000 vehicles per day crossed the bridge Marcus Webb photographed. On the morning he pulled over and took his photograph, that bridge had not been physically inspected in 4 years. Its last 4 inspection reports, each describing it as structurally sound, had been generated at a desk in Frankfurt by a man who had never visited the site. Donna Halsey had spent 12 years at the Department of Transportation learning exactly how federal bridge inspection reimbursement protocols worked, which documentation elements triggered federal funding releases, and which certification structures were accepted without independent verification. She had then spent the following 9 years building a falsification architecture designed to exploit the exact protocol gap she had spent her career helping to maintain. Marcus Webb, the civil engineer whose photograph opened the case, returned to work the week after the arrests. The comparison he had made, his phone photograph against a public inspection report, was not part of any formal monitoring system. No agency had asked him to check. No protocol required it. He had simply driven past the same bridge for 3 years, noticed a crack, and on one particular morning decided to look more carefully. If a falsification network this large, covering 340 uninspected bridges across 17 counties, generating $61 million in fraudulent federal reimbursements, leaving 47 structurally deteriorating structures certified as safe, could operate for 8 years inside a state transportation department because a single federal reimbursement protocol accepted a signed certification without independent physical verification. How many other bridges are certified as safe tonight on the strength of a signature, and nothing else?